Position is more likely to be true than not. Simply asserting that it is the case isn't going to cut it for me, which is also why we don't allow religious moral laws to intrude into, say, things like the Constitution or American law. We have a very clear divide between religion and state. There should be a wall there. Now that wall has gone through periods where it's been really high and really low, but by and large, that wall has always been there, and hopefully we can continue to strengthen that wall. That's part of the reason why I'm here. Now, morality, as far as I'm concerned, is relatively simple. We all have an innate understanding of what is right and wrong. I don't necessarily agree with Hitchens. I don't think that it's inherent. I do think that there is some degree of indoctrination that is required in order to develop into a morally healthy person by my atheist humanist standards. That is to say, if you were some sort of feral child being raised by wolves, I highly doubt it that you would have come to a moral system that I would find anything less than abominable. Or, you know, we don't have to go that extreme. Let's just say you were raised by 10 people out in the jungle or the desert or out in the middle of the ocean somewhere. It really doesn't matter. Without some sort of guidance, without feedback and a way to test and experiment, you're not really going to come to a rational ethical system. You're just not going to be able to come up with a good moral code that way. It requires a life experience, and it requires, in my opinion anyway, it requires life experience, and it requires somebody to help guide you through this process. I think that's why moral development has taken so long. I think that I do think that it is the case that there are certain aspects of our anatomy, of biology, of reality itself that do force us to generally adhere to a moral system that is very similar with every other moral system. For example, it's universally accepted that murder is bad. It's not a good thing. There are very few cultures have ever existed that have been laissez-faire on murder. Do what you're going to do, have fun. If there isn't repercussion for murder, you're going to have chaos and anarchy. And the same generally applies with all the major topics, thievery, rape, on and on. I mean, these are pretty basic concepts, but as I've mentioned before, there are also reasons why we come to these conclusions, whether or not. So let's take these people these 10 people being raised in the desert on their own. I say that the majority of their ethical system are going to come from life experience and indoctrination, but there are also certain biological factors which are inescapable, certain heuristics, which are, heuristic is a keyword, meaning it's a mental shortcut. It's something that your brain does automatically to basically snip the fat so that it's easier to remember and you can react quicker, often without even having to think about it. It's a rule of thumb is a good way to think about it. It's your brain creating rules of thumb. But we are a social species, and as such, there are certain inherited traits that we get from that. Being a social species, we inherently do feel a sense of empathy, generally speaking. Spare sociopaths and the like, which are very rare. This sense of empathy is the primordial foundation of morality. Empathy is really what gets this ball rolling. If you didn't have empathy, then you're likely not really going to develop into an ethical or moral individual without proper guidance. Now, I don't want to crap on the sociopaths and psychopaths out there. Not all of them, in fact, hardly any of them are out there murdering people. That they're just emotionless people, by and large. I mean, so they still feel some emotion, usually, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be going out there raping and pillaging and doing everything that they want to do, living those hedonistic lifestyles. In fact, it's very rare, but they still have a lot of these other inherited traits that we get. So things like mirror neurons. This is a part of empathy, but these apply in other areas as well. When we see somebody suffering, we can empathize with that, because if you've ever suffered in any way, or if you've ever seen someone suffer, you can just imagine what that's like. You can imagine that suffering would be that suffering that this person's going through would be horrible if it was in fact you suffering. And we can place ourselves in that person's shoes, so to speak. And so these mirror neurons can also play a factor, whether or not you're sensing any sort of emotional feedback. You could still get a conscious feedback on this, or even a subconscious one, which can tell you, okay, look, based on what I know about society, this is bad. So all of these things play into it. So how can I come up with a system of morality without a God? Like I said, it's relatively simple. I honestly don't think most people need to spend inordinate amounts of time trying to figure this out. I think because we've developed as we have, most people are generally good people. But if you really want to get down to the nitty-gritty of it, my opinion is you need to base everything on fact and reality, plain and simple. And how can you do that with something as quote subjective as morality? Again, you have to factor in things like harm and well-being. It is objectively the case that cutting somebody's arm off is, well, let's go a bit more extreme, because there are people, for example, the man who was pinned. You know what? Let's keep this example. Let's run with it. So, a perfectly healthy person who has no desire to have their arm cut off, cutting that person's arm off is bad for them. It is objectively bad for them. Is it objectively morally bad for them? No, I won't go that far. But we're not quite there yet. We're still working on our foundation. Let's build up, guys. We don't necessarily have to have all the answers at the start. Okay, we have an individual who doesn't want his arm cut off, or her arm. We cut it off. How do we know that that is objectively bad? Well, we can, at this point, take a half a step back and start doing some generalizations. Generally speaking, it is better to have 2 arms. Okay, check. Generally speaking, most people are born with 2 arms and operate much better having 2 arms. Check, okay, that's good. Generally speaking, having your arm cut off is extremely painful and traumatizing. I think we can all agree that that is bad. It is objectively the case that cutting off a healthy person's arm who doesn't want their arm cut off is bad. But it is not an objective, capital M, morally bad thing. How do I know this to be the case? Well, there are people who've had to have their arms cut off. There have been people who've had to have somebody cut their arm off for them. There are people who've had to cut arms off other people. There have been people who had to cut their own arms off. There's a very famous case of a mountain climber who got his arm pinned and was stuck in on a mountain cliff for 3 or 4 days, or whatever the case may be. And he had to cut off his own arm in order to survive. Now, if you were going to take any sort of objective moral stance on arm cutting off free, whatever you want to call that, amputation, I suppose, then what he would have done would be morally bad. But that is not the case, because this individual ended up surviving only because they did that. They are, in fact, better off. Their life has benefited, even though they had to harm themselves. So, that being the case, Caleb, but you said you operate on harm and well-being. This person had to harm himself. How is harm a moral good? Well, as I had mentioned before, we have to take a half a step back yet again, and let's evaluate. How can cutting off or causing harm be in and of itself a good thing? Dan Barker does a great job of explaining this. Again, we're operating under the assumption that there aren't objective moral systems out there put in place that just exist for whatever reason. And that being the case, you have to weigh the pros and the cons for any particular situation. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating that that there aren't certain things which are in pretty much every case objectively morally bad. Let's take genocide, for example. Is there ever going to be a good instance of genocide? Probably not. Probably not. I can't say that definitively, but I can say with relative certainty that I don't think anyone's ever going to come up with a rational, morally correct argument for genocide. I just don't think it's going to happen. I can't think of it, but that's just me. Now, anyway, so Dan Barker, he gives a great example to explain how and why sometimes you need to cause some harm to cause, or have an effect rather, that has a greater good. Vaccinations is a great example. You know, we all would agree that generally speaking, it's bad to stab babies. It's very bad, even with just a little needle, right? Nobody would take a syringe and just stab a baby and think, well, you know, it happens. No, we all agree, stabbing a baby with a needle is bad. But here's the kicker. If you're just stabbing them for the sake of stabbing them or for any other reason other than to do an actual provably better thing, the vaccination is going to improve the quality of life for that individual. It's going to, not only that individual, but the people around them. Thank you, herd immunity. And for those of you who don't know what that is, Google. Herd immunity is very important. Vaccinations are very important. Things like, I'm going to tangent here for just a half a second, but things like the measles, for example, it requires something like 80%, 85% of a given population to be vaccinated in order to maintain herd immunity. And if that number drops below that percentage, then that means that outbreaks are likely to occur. And they have actually occurred because herd immunity had dropped below a certain percentage. That's happened here in the States, as a matter of fact, and not that long ago. A lot of that happened during the, I think it was Kylie Jenner, I want to say her name was, but I could be very wrong about that. But the lady who was all about anti-vaccinations and really helped steamroll that whole movement, yeah, screw you, lady. I'm sorry. I hate you. That is a moral abomination. That is what I can consider a moral. I'll just say it again. I'll just reiterate. That is a moral abomination. These people are convincing people, other people, that vaccinations are bad, that they do more harm than good, that they're not worth the inherent risks. But again, we'll probably talk about vaccinations here in a little bit. I do want to stay on track and hopefully answer this individual's question as thoroughly as I can. It's just me up here today, so I got a lot of time to talk. Morality, again, it's a relatively simple process. You can look at any given situation, and all you really need to do is weigh the pros and cons. Is this more likely going to create a benefit that outweighs the harm? Let's say, I don't know, dying because you can't cut your own arm off? That would be bad. If you want to live. If you want to die, I mean, here's the thing though. If this person decided that it would be better to die than cut off their arm, I can't say that that's a wrong choice. I can't say that the risk of cutting off your own arm and dying from exposure or shock or blood loss, whatever the case may be, those are all inherent risks. Every action that we take has an inherent risk. Driving a car has an inherent risk. Smoking cigarettes, walking down the street, everything that we do has an inherent risk. And you have to weigh those risks and decide for yourself if those risks are worth it. This translates into morality. You need to decide for yourself whether or not what you are doing is going to have a greater benefit that's worth the risk, whatever that happens to be. That's why a lot of these things tend to get so foggy. I heard an example about parenthood, for example. What are the moral obligations that a parent are constricted to? I mean, are there any? For example, is a parent obligated to run into a burning building to save their child? My personal opinion is no. I don't think that a parent is obligated to do that. I mean, don't get me wrong, I personally would encourage it if I thought that there was even the slightest chance that the child could be saved, but that's my priority. I tend to prioritize children myself. That's a personal opinion. But these are in extreme situations. Generally speaking, I don't usually look at children as much ethically different than anybody else. I try to generalize and talk about people as people and not necessarily old people, young people, middle-aged people, etc. Those nuances come in. Those nuances come into play during very specific conversations. That I'm more or less talking about my broad version of morality. So anyway, I'm actually going to go ahead and cut it there. I'm sorry I forgot this person's name. Just give me one moment here. John. Yeah, so thank you, John, for that question, and I really do hope that I answered that for you. I'm sorry, apparently we lost our live feed for a little bit there. I have no idea when we lost the feed, but I'm told we are back on again. One thing that I would like to do is mention the fact that we're going to be having the president of Free Thought Fort Wayne on our next episode as well, likely. Let me put it that way. She may or may not actually be on our next episode, but she will either be on the next one or shortly thereafter. I'll explain in a minute why that's the case. But let me double check and make sure. Yes, okay. So Karen Mintzner, wow. Excuse me, Karen Mintzner is the president of Free Thought Fort Wayne, and she'll actually be joining us for an episode. I'm likely going to be co-hosting that day, but you might get Nikki if you guys are lucky. I like Nikki a lot. She does a fantastic job on this show. Love you, Nikki. She will be on to discuss what Free Thought Fort Wayne does, what they represent, the Free Thought Fort Wayne philosophy, humanism, and she'll also be here to answer your questions, comments, and concerns as well. So if you want to talk to the head of the whole shebang, Free Thought Fort Wayne Incorporated, the president, October 2nd, she, I did it again, will likely be on the 2nd, but we might end up pushing her towards another episode. Reason being is because I'm hoping, haven't actually had this conversation yet, it just was a thought that came up today. Hopefully we'll have Damien from the Satanist group actually here. They are local, relatively speaking. I'm pretty sure that their chapter isn't even all that far from here. So if we're really, really lucky, I can actually get the man to sit here next to me and we can have that conversation that way. But I'm thinking if the man's going to call in, we'll probably still have Karen on the show and we can interview them together for maybe the first 20 or 30 minutes and then spend the rest of the time talking with Karen about Free Thought Fort Wayne. Now, on that note, I did also want to, well, maybe I won't do that. Let's see how we're looking on time. I'm going to ask the booth if they could tell me how long I have been on, but in the meantime, I'm going to just let you guys know this is a rant episode. There are a lot of different things that I could go on a rant about, so where to begin? Why do I, you know what, I want to talk about this. I want to talk about apologetics and counter-apologetics just a little bit, just a smidge. 35 minutes into the show. We're 35 minutes in? Okay, thank you. Here in the near future, I'd like to go into some detail on apologetics and counter-apologetics. Now, I don't mean on like a college PhD theology course level. We don't need to get that crazy into it. I'm really talking more of a primer. One of the issues that comes up quite often with these sort of conversations is that a lot of theists don't even know their own apologetics. It's often the case that they get them second or third or fourth hand, or they just make crap up and they think it sounds good. The problem is apologetics, it varies. There are a lot of different types of apologetics. Apologetics, by the way, is merely the defense of a position. Generally speaking, apologetics is specific to theology, Christian theology more specifically. But there are, broadly speaking, there are apologetics for Hinduism or anything. I mean, you can even be a Bigfoot apologist if you really want to be. And the counterpart for that is counter-apologetics, which is what I consider something, I don't know, I don't want to, I'll screw it. I consider myself sort of a counter-apologist. I became interested in apologetics after listening to several episodes of The Atheist Experience. And one of the reasons why I want to discuss apologetics in the future is because, well, for one, I actually find it riveting. I think it's really entertaining and interesting. I think that the sheer differences in varying apologetics are intriguing in and of themselves. But I actually think it's important. I think that if people evaluate their apologetics, their own apologetics, they might actually discover quite a few flaws in their system, in their thinking, in their worldview. That was the case for me, and I imagine that's the case for most any atheist who ever was a theist at some point. They likely had to discover these things for themselves, and that process would likely mean that they had to at least look into the apologetic arguments. Whether or not they realized that they were looking into what's known as apologetics is sort of beside the point. Apologetic arguments are things like the cosmological argument, for example. The cosmological argument is an argument put forth by theists of all stripes. I mean, there are Muslims putting forth their versions, I should say. Pretty much all the monotheisms have some sort of cosmological argument, which I suppose since I have the time, I'll just mention the argument itself. It simply states that everything that begins to exist has a cause, premise 1. The universe began to exist, premise 2. Therefore, the universe had a cause. I actually spent several years thinking that this was a difficult egg to crack. Like I couldn't break it. I couldn't figure out quite the best way to approach this. And then it just suddenly came to my attention one day. I don't know who, I can't even remember who brought this to my attention. It doesn't matter. It's not even an argument for God. It's just an argument that something likely jump-started the universe. Whatever that is, there is a cause. that cause doesn't have to be God. So this is an example of apologetics, the cosmological argument, and counter-apologetics. The statement that I made when I said there doesn't need to be a God that was the cause. In fact, one of my favorite theories that for a jump start to the universe anyway, is actually from string theory, where there are these things called membranes. They touched, and the moment that they touched, the universe sort of spawned from that spot, that location. I thought that was interesting. I'm not saying that that's true. In fact, I don't believe that to be the case. But insofar as, you know, having causes for the universe, that's my favorite, quote, cause of the universe. I actually don't personally believe there was a cause. I don't think there was a rhyme or a reason. I think it just is myself. Either that or it is, in fact, eternal. Now, here's the kicker. Because I just said that, I said maybe it is eternal, maybe it's not, blah, blah, blah. Now, a theist or an apologist, it doesn't really even matter, could then jump in and say, well, now you're making a claim here. You're saying that it's actually possible that the universe existed forever. And so then you're going to start tumbling down a lot of these different rabbit holes. I just want you guys to understand, as you're watching this, that you don't necessarily have to go down all of these rabbit holes. We, in the atheist position, have no burden of proof. All you merely need to say is, I don't know. I honestly don't know, which I don't. I'll be honest. I have no clue what jump-started the universe, if anything. I have absolutely no clue. None. I don't feel like I need to know in order to come to the conclusion that it's still far more likely that there is not a God than that there is a God. And these arguments, the cosmological argument and so forth, are apologetics that do have the onus, because they're making a positive claim and they're sticking to it. They're saying not only was there a cause, but it was my God that was that cause. So these are the sort of things that I would like to discuss, and I want to get into a lot of the terminology. And I would really appreciate as well if any one of you watchers and listeners out there would call in to discuss such issues. 260-422-3902. Do you have a favorite argument? The cosmological argument, argument from design, you name it. I'll talk about any and every argument that you've got. And there are bonus points if you can present an argument to me that I have yet to hear. Buku bonus points. Prize to be announced, but I promise there is a prize. Give me an argument I haven't heard, you get a prize. From me personally, I promise. I'm excited about that. Please, somebody out there, anybody. I'm waiting. And here's the thing. I want everybody to understand. I say that for a reason, because as I mentioned at the very beginning of the show, and as I've mentioned time and time again, atheism is the position that you do not believe. It's not necessarily the assertion that there is no God. I am in the position, excuse me, sorry for bumping the mic. I am in the position of just simply not believing. So, theists, apologists, all you guys out there, if you have a good argument, I am honestly going to tell you, I am willing to be convinced. I am absolutely willing. I spent years of my life trying to dive through apologetics and all of the arguments for not only for gods, but for things, for the supernatural. I'll just put it that way, keep it short and simple. Years and years. And I cannot find anything remotely definitive. I can't find a single shred of evidence. I can't find a good argument that doesn't boil down to bad grammar or fallacious reasoning. So if you've got something, please call, let me know. I'd love to hear from any of you guys. You can also email the show, weareatheiststv@gmail.com. Check us out on Facebook. You can interact with us there. I'm on that Facebook often. The Discord server, you can find information on that on our Facebook page. But on that note, guys, I think I'm going to go ahead and just cut it a bit short. Sorry to do it. I'm running out of steam. And I think my rant has officially come to an end. So on that note, guys, I do want to thank any and everybody for watching. And as always, we are atheists. And I'll see you next time. And are we going to cut?